Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight, I am joined by James Kalb to discuss liberalism. Thanks for coming on, James.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so as far as like antecedents or the origins of liberalism, I think one antecedent that is important is nominalism. Liberalism, sort of in its radical egalitarianism and its radical leveling of classes and everything else, is sort of predicated on a certain denial of universals. We see this when they say men and women are interchangeable, they're not different at all, which is essentially denying these sort of innate differences, right? Locke's tabula rasa of the blank slate is, in some sense, I think, inspired and indebted to nominalism because it's a denial of innate ideas, right? The tabula rasa is the denial of innate ideas, which are of some form of universal. And so by denying universals, you kind of create a space in which liberalism can develop. Do you think that there's any, what are your thoughts on that, or how liberalism
I think that's so. No, I've never traced it back that far because I tried to go into medieval nominalism at one point, and it's it's highly technical, it's highly academic. It takes a lot of work really to think that they had a grip on what they were doing. But it's certainly plausible. I mean, the basic idea of nominalism is that things don't have natures. And so it becomes harder to view the goal of life as fulfilling your nature, of becoming part of some overall scheme of things that's a good scheme of things that you want to live by and draw sustenance from. And instead, you're in a setting where you decide how you're going to sort through things and what you're going to want. And so you really get the arbitrary human will as the guiding feature of human life. And you start with that, and what do you do with the wills? There's a lot of different wills. They all are equal as wills, and so they have presumptively equal claim to be satisfied. And so you get equal freedom as the ultimate goal after a lot of development. And work its way through the institutions and attitudes of society, and I think that's where we are now.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point there. When you sort of deny the essential natures of things, you have these competing wills. Now, liberalism postures itself as the method to peacefully adjudicate between these competing wills. Now, one of the things that ends up happening, and this is pointed out by the philosopher Ed Feser in his criticism of libertarianism, which is just one other evolution of liberalism, is that while on paper they deny any sort of normative good that we should strive for, when these competing wills are, you actually have to get on the brass tacks and then solve a dispute, somebody's view of what is good triumphs over somebody else's view of what is good, and it's no longer some sort of bland, generic, neutral position. It actually now has, it actually sort of undermines its own principles, because the principle is we don't have any positions. We're just here to be an umpire to negotiate and settle these disputes. But when these disputes are settled, somebody's normative view of the good triumphs, and they pretend that doesn't happen. And I think that's one of the great successes of liberalism, is that it has deceived people into thinking that it's not actually picking sides when it is picking in sides.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's a basic problem. You really can't give equal credence to everybody's will. You have to have some sort of way of deciding. And so I think there's basically two approaches. One is that you distinguish legitimate desires from non-legitimate desires. And the legitimate desires are the ones that are easy to fit together, the sort of self-regarding. In the present time, it's legitimate to want a career because that brings you into the system of production and distribution that provides people with goods. It's legitimate to want consumer goods because this big list of things you can buy, and everybody can buy one or another on the list, and there's no difficulty reconciling the different desires. And you can have different hobbies or personal indulgences as long as they don't cause other people big problems. And so those are the favored desires. And then the non-favored desires are the basic human desires to be part of something greater or to work toward some good that transcends yourself. Because if you do that, then you're favoring a structure that not only affects you, but it affects other people, because those are essentially social desires. And so that liberalism has to work away from that. They have to tell you that, well, no, that's intolerant. You're being oppressive and hateful, so therefore you can really only try to bring about your own desires for your own experiences. So that's one side of it. The other side is that, after all, they want something that supports the structure and its continuation and efficiency. So that also tells you what desires are okay. It's not okay to want to be a drug addict, even though that's like a self-centered type of thing that doesn't affect other people immediately, because it causes other people problems. And so on. So those two things. First, being easy to fit into the system, being doing and wanting things that are easy to fit into the system, and second, supporting the system. For example, by wanting a career. Those are the things that become the favorite desires, and then the others just have to get suppressed.
It's exactly. One, when you made me think of E. Michael Jones in his book Libido Dominandi. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he argues that the sexual impulse was used as a way to control populations in the modern age. And so some of these desires that are, quote, acceptable in the liberal order are those desires that make us easier to be manipulated. Desires that make us harder to be manipulated are seen as bad. And those tend to be those that elevate us to some transcendent goal or good. And so by doing that, they make us easier to manage. And this kind of gets into some of Noam Chomsky as well, where he talks about, how Walter Lippmann and other personalities that tried to create managed democracy, right? People can't think or act for themselves. They need people to think for them. And so they create a way to manage a democratic system that allows them to still maintain all of the control that they want. And so those desires that facilitate that control are those desires that are good. And those desires that don't facilitate that are typically seen as bad. Now, you brought up something else, too, which we often hear termed as victimless crimes. So, liberals, libertarians, far left people will say, well, drug addiction is... Some say drugs are victimless crime and should be decriminalized. Libertarians tend to be on that side. Liberals tend to be more, well, it hurts people, we should stop doing it. But if you look at like externalities like that, one of the most obvious externalities is the externalities of sex outside of marriage. You have venereal diseases. You have illegitimate children, which are a cost on society. Of course, it's great for the state because the state can then step in with more welfare programs. They're going to say, well, you can't let the kids starve. Well, no, you shouldn't. You should force the men to take care of the kids that they beget. But they don't want you to do that either. But what it does is increases state power. And so again, but again, which externalities should be say are good and which ones are bad, right? If you're going to say, well, okay, having sex outside of marriage is okay, even though we know it hurts people, but then say, well, you can't smoke because it hurts you. Well, why? I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to why you pick some externalities to ban and not others.
Well, I think there's some rhyme or reason, from the standpoint of the system, because traditional sexual morality and various other loyalties created strong bonds between people. Go through through liberal institutions. It went through the institutional family, the extended family, and then larger than that, the local informal community, the ethnic people, and so on. And liberalism doesn't like that because those sort of get in the way. It makes things harder to administer. There's all this other stuff going on that bureaucrats don't know much about and can't really deal with effectively, and that it can't be dealt with through the market, which makes everything commensurable through money. And so they mess up the system. So externalities that break down traditional relationships, like marriage, are okay. Whereas externalities like taking heroin, which lead people to start stealing, or which cause medical problems or make them not reliable as employees, aren't okay. So I think internally to the system, there is a criterion which makes sense. Humanly speaking, of course, it's horrible to sort of downplay the damage of injuring the normal relationships that people live by. But that's not liberalism.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. One of the things I think you've written about recently is the sort of the way liberalism sort of dissolves identities, specifically in the context of the male-female identity, where they're seen as interchangeable and they're not really different at all. Maybe you could explain some of your positions on how liberalism plays a part in that.
Okay, well, part of it goes back to the original philosophical background, which you started with, talking about nominalism. If you have nominalism, then you don't have, things don't have natures. So if they don't have natures, then there's really no basis for identity. It's something that's simply self-chosen or self-created. Secondly, liberalism prefers, sort of formal, rational structures that are sort of technological in nature, that like to break down things into sort of graded raw materials and rational industrial processes and so on. So they're okay with classifying people by certified expertise or something like that. But to say, well, this guy's a Swede and that guy's an Italian, and this is a man, that's a woman, so they realize different expectations are to be expected. That's not good from their standpoint. And apart from which, identities, traditional identities, are intrinsically associated with traditional ways of functioning. Man and woman has to do with marriage. And being an Italian or a Swede has to do with ethnic community, which brings with it all sorts of traditional understandings, expectations, cultural demands that liberalism doesn't like, because once again, they're sort of outside the liberal system, outside the system of formal, rational institutions that are run in accordance with the market or with bureaucracy. And so therefore, getting rid of them helps bring about the efficiency and clarity and transparency that they aspire to.
Yeah, it seems like the sort of goal of liberalism, which undergirds its rational calculations, is Christ said, accused the Pharisees, he said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He was accusing the Pharisees of subordinating man to this blessing that God gave us for our own benefit, not for us to serve it. And the idea of the philosopher Ivan Illich mentions this, the idea of instrumentality, where in the ancient medieval worlds, tools and trades were seen as an extension of that individual. So for like a knight, the sword was an extension of his body. A blacksmith, a hammer was an extension of his body. And so it was conceptually very difficult to separate the tools and the trade from the individual doing it. Whereas in the modern age, what we have with industrialization is that factories we switch the role. Rather than being human-centered, it's now machine-centered. So the machine is the focus, and men are there to serve the machine. We become cogs in the machine to serve, and of course, the machines in the factories, they want efficiency, so they can produce more goods more cheaply. And so what we have is it seems that liberalism has flipped the traditional way of viewing labor and humanity. Traditionally, labor was seen as an extension of the individual, and the individual was the sort of, he gave meaning to that effort. Whereas now it's these, you know, bland calculations, this sort of bloodless abstraction where there's a machine. And so in many ways, we've forgotten what Christ said, you know, the tool was not made for man to serve, but the tool was made to serve man.
Well, yeah. I mean, the industrial system, you know, it's this abstract system that wants to treat the inputs as interchangeable. You know, the assembly line, you have interchangeable parts. You can get raw materials from everywhere. There's methods that have been developed of grading them so that you know which is appropriate for which process. And the aspiration is to treat human beings like that as well, because you have a clearer system that seems more rational and transparent. If all parts of it can fit into it equally, and that seems rational and just and everything that it should be. So you know, there is that tendency, and of course it's exacerbated by the fact that at least in a gross sense, it's been extremely productive. You know, you do have much larger food production and clothing production and so on. I mean, you might complain about aesthetic issues, but even so, it's been very effective.
Yeah, the effectiveness of streamlining production has been very important in the rise of liberalism. But it's interesting that liberalism, right, it sells itself as freedom. It allows you to, what it says it allows you to do is that, you know, you're free. There's no external pressures on you. There's no church, you know, the state's minimized. You can pretty much, you know, reinvent yourself however you like. Aristotle defined a slave as a living tool. And in many ways, this inversion of the traditional view of work has made us all into slaves. We're all living tools. We're treated just like an assembly line, but we're not inanimate objects. We're living objects. So in some fundamental way, this ideology that offers us absolute freedom has actually created us as slaves, according to the Aristotelian definition of a slave, that of a living tool.
Well, yeah, that's actually a very good point. That you know, we're living tools, so therefore it's not freedom. I mean, another way to look at it is that the freedom it offers you is freedom within a sort of a very restricted system. So it's your Burger King, you know, have it your way, which means that there's a menu of things that you can choose among, and that's what your freedom consists of. It's freedom to choose among interchangeable things that can be equally supplied to anybody, and that's not really freedom that's worth aspiring to. It's the freedom of somebody with a certain amount of money in a department store, which is fine, but is that something to live life by, or to idealize? It doesn't seem so.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of William Cavanaugh's work. His criticism of the current market system. He said that for Augustine, the idea of viewing freedom as just choice, the multiplicity of choice, is highly defective. Right? Freedom for Augustine, the classical and Christian tradition, would be freedom to fully express your nature, the perfection of your nature. Right? So Aristotle had this idea of teleology, where things have natures and they progress towards that nature. The acorn's nature is to become a tree, and so it progresses to the tree. And so true freedom would consist in the individual being able to fully actualize his true nature. And of course, the political order was so structured in order to make actions that would lead into retrograde motion difficult to perform through legal penalties, and remove legal penalties and give rewards to those actions that would encourage people to actualize their true nature. And he seems to argue, and he has a solution, it's an interesting solution, is that the problem with the market is that there's no substantive good, well, there is one governing it. It's just a wrong one. But what he says is that you should supplant, he views it, he doesn't see there's an objective good there, governing the market. I think there's one that's in its efficiency. But substituted that with a more traditionalist perspective of ends and goals and natures. And right, you don't need to have some sort of state apparatus like the Soviet Russia managing the economy. What he's talking about is more of a change in production and consumption, where the society doesn't value this anymore. And I think that would be a step in the right direction if we get enough people to think like that.
Well, yeah, I think that's basically the way you get beyond liberalism is you say, well, gee, what's the point of life? The point of life is a good life. You can't talk about politics reasonably without saying, well, what kind of life are we building here? And that put things on a very different footing from saying that, well, you're trying to empower everybody equally and promote everybody's equal prosperity, which sounds nice, but it doesn't really mean that people can write their own ticket, because the arrangements that promote that end up giving you a range of choices that really isn't worthy of human nature.
Yeah, it reduces us to utility calculators, which is a very meager understanding of the full range of human faculties. One of the things that liberalism also likes to pride itself on is its ability to resolve conflicts, right? Generally, the narrative goes, there are these nasty religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and because religion is this reactionary, backward thing anyhow. And you have these, plucky Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, and Jefferson and Madison. He said, yeah, let's just get religion out of this, and we'll let the state moderate these conflicts. And of course, they do it, quote, peacefully, because they allow people to express their their own individual choices. And so being this neutral umpire that decides. Now, of course, the funny thing is when they say this, the liberal order as it was implanted by the French Republic, beginning with the French Republic and the French Revolution, the English system beginning probably with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the U.S. system was all built on a massive bloodletting on par with the 30 Years' War. So the very sort of violent struggles they condemned when performed by religious people, Catholics and Protestants, they engaged in to create this order that is supposed to ensure peace. And as we see in the 21st century with increasing migration into Europe from the Africa and the Middle East and international terrorism, it's really not that effective at maintaining order and peace.
Yeah, well, there's difficulties. One difficulty is whether you have the basis for social loyalty, cohesion, and order in the long run, because there's a tendency to buy off people who complain, and that's not going to work forever. There's also a tendency to discuss to break down the connections between people that people live by, which makes it harder for them to act, which makes it harder for them to carry on conflict, I suppose. But in the long run, how is that going to work? What's the end game? And then there's a difficulty that it grows increasingly imperialistic. The United States has been constantly engaged in war. You mostly devoted creating to shoring up and extending the liberal order. You want to bring superior gender relations to Afghanistan or something like that. You think that if you overthrow all the Arab governments, then since people all want to be liberals, that's the only way anybody sensible could want to be, then that's going to happen. Of course, it doesn't. So
yeah.
The promise, be fulfilled. It's based on an idea of human nature is very limited, and the goods people are going to live with as being the goods that liberalism thinks it can offer them.
Yeah. To hit again on this deracinating of individuals, I'm reminded of Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue, where he discusses the Homeric man. He says that, the only person that didn't have an identity was an outlaw. Everybody else had some sort of web of identities as a father, as maybe a king, as a member of this city-state, or as a member of the group of Hellenes that worship the Greek gods. And all of these different identities that create this web of identity allowed this individual to know what his place was in the world and the cosmos. And with the only outlaws really didn't have that. These are people that were, they often resorted to banditry because they had no other way to, people wouldn't deal with them. They were like untouchables or something. And that's what liberalism does. What liberalism does is it makes us all outcasts in our own country where we have no identity. And, it's getting to these extremes where we have, transgenderism, where people are reinventing their sexual identity, even in the face of their biology. And if people are constantly reinventing their identity, there's nothing static. There's nothing there long enough. You see, to become a person, to grow as a person, you have to have some sort of consistent baseline that can then take an experience, process it, and then act on it in the future. It's sort of like with wealth creation, right? One of the first steps is getting married and having a house or having property. And then you have this level of predictability and stability that allows you to then expand and grow your life in new ways. So if we looked at it as a sort of a psychological level, if you are constantly, constantly getting divorced, so to speak, and you're never actually laying a solid foundation, then you're never actually able to build a reserve of experiences that you can then reflect on and then learn from and grow from, because there's no fixed point. It's just always in flux. And we see with Aristotle and the description of classical tyrannies, that is one of the key strategies of classical tyrannies, is that they would attack your identities. Aristotle said in Book 2 of the Politics that tyrants would often empower women and slaves at the expense of their husbands and masters, knowing on the one hand that they were no threat to his actual power. Aristotle said they have a good time under his rule, but also taking advantage of the husband and the master's natural affection for their wife and slaves to not use their superior strength to just beat them up to get their way. They'll back down. And so that they can be intimidated by the tyrant to acquiesce to his authority. There's that famous example where the tyrant of Syracuse sends an ambassador to some Ionian city-state in the Aegean, on the Asiatic coast of the Aegean, and he asks him, for his master, how do you keep people in line? He walks out into the field and starts whacking off the tallest flowers. And the servant's like, I don't know what that means. But he tells this tyrant in Syracuse he knows exactly what that means. And so this liberal attempt to level everybody, to punish excellence, to dissolve identity, to divide us amongst ourselves, these are all classical this is what the definition of classical tyranny is, if you read Aristotle in the Bible. And so while promising us freedom, it makes us slaves, living tools, and it also is a total tyranny in the classical sense of tyranny.
Well, yeah. Well, freedom and democracy can't really be ruling principles because you have to have order of some sort. So, what you have to do is order that's maintained indirectly by making it impossible for people to resist or make it impossible for them to act, and breaking down the connections among them and depriving them of any basis in their understanding of themselves for resisting is certainly a basic way of doing it. That's a lot of what liberals have in mind when they talk about things like religion or ethnic distinctions as being divisive. It means that, well, you can't really put everybody in the same category where nobody can really do anything. It makes it harder to tell people that, well, if you resist change, which means not doing what you're told, then you got some serious problem. So that there has to be some indirect way of getting around the implications of the idea of having freedom and equality and democracy as leading principles. And so that's what's done. You make it impossible for people to act effectively and to think for themselves by depriving them of durable connections, durable self-understandings. So they become you're just this mass of social atoms which doesn't even have continuity over time.
Exactly. One concrete example that I often like to point to is the attack on male fraternities. For instance, in the 19th century, we see this, and probably the most famous example would be in the fictional stories of Sherlock Holmes of the Diogenes Club, where it's basically a men's club where they debate politics and philosophy and basically build these bonds. Now, Aristotle said that politics was based off of men bound together by love for one another's souls to serve the good. And those are the only kinds of men that tyrants have to fear, right? When the Tarquins were overthrown, when Sparta was kicked out of Thebes, when, even the American Revolution, when the American Patriots organized, they are all based around these male fraternities that were the sort of leading agent of change against these power structures. And one of the most effective ways to destroy any attempt at overthrowing these power structures is to attack male fraternities, right? So it's totally okay to have all women's groups, women's spaces, but to have, like, for instance, I remember VMI got in trouble a few years back because it was an all-male military academy, and they said, no, you gotta have women in there. There's no attempt at forcing men into women's spheres. If there's an all-women's club or an all-women's organization, and they can exclude men and nobody cares. But again, from the perspective of the establishment, they're not a threat. Aristotle told us this. But men are. And so there's been a concerted effort to break up male-only spaces, where to this point, the only place you can have male-only spaces seems to be online with video games, unfortunately. Because everywhere else in the public sphere, it seems to have been edged out.
Well, yeah, or like going to the bar and watching football. I mean, there could be a few women there, but they're basically hangers-on. It's a masculine activity. A writer who emphasizes this quite a lot is Tony Esolen, by the way. Catholic writer. He's got into a bunch of trouble in his college because he said that diversity really isn't that great an ideal, and he writes very well, and he emphasizes this. I guess partly because he's a college professor and therefore takes an interest in education and how the young develop. And he says that people say that men are civilized by women, and they really aren't. He says they're domesticated by women. To civilize them, to develop them as men, you need masculine societies.
Exactly.
And that's what can't exist now.
Yeah, which is in part why we have so many disaffected, violent young men in the United States. You see it probably most extreme in the Black inner city community due to the social breakdown there as a result of liberalism, but you also see it in the Hispanic and increasingly in the white community as well, where these disaffected young men that never had proper male mentorship are lashing out against the actual injustices of the system, but they're doing it in a way that's very counterproductive and ineffective and socially dangerous to the rest of us. Recently, Niall Ferguson debated Fareed Zakaria on the premise, is the liberal international order over? And he opened up with the quote from Voltaire, paraphrasing Voltaire, saying that the liberal international order is neither liberal nor international nor an order. And he argues that liberalism, in order to be orderly, has to violate the very principles of liberalism. So the more consistently liberal it is, the less order it produces. But if it produces order, then the less liberal it is. And there becomes this internal contradiction that undermines the entire system. And furthermore, economic liberalism, the sort of neoliberal consensus of the 80s and 90s, has really not done that well for the working class people in the United States and in Europe. He sees Donald Trump's popularity as a sort of a sea change in that regard. These people have lost their jobs. They've gone overseas to China. Akron, near where I live, there used to be a large rubber tire industry. You could get out of college, no, get out of high school, and get a job, get married, have a house and kids, and you can have a very comfortable life, from like the 1950s on. But then these all got shut down, and various social dislocation occurred with the sexual revolution, cultural revolution, economic changes, inflation, and all that. And so this sense of stability and safety is gone. And the working class in Europe and America are like, hey, we got left behind. The bureaucrats, the academics, the people in news and media, the economists, they made off pretty well. But the rest of us have been paying a high externality for it. And he thinks that coupled with the migrant crisis in Europe, because Islam is very anti-liberal, obviously, and the failure of liberalism to provide a stable order is all contributing to its ultimate dissolution sometime in the near future.
Yeah, well, that's a problem with the liberal international order. Is it going to be ideally liberal, where something like the EU and the UN, create this order through negotiation and parliamentary and bureaucratic style institutions, or is it really going to have to rely on American nationalism and military power to create the best imitation of it that can really be sustained? Because that's the ostensible reason for like the various wars that we've been engaged in. But if you're relying on American ideological nationalism and military power, then obviously it's not a liberal order. It's something else. What it is not clear, and whether it's sustainable or durable, seems unlikely. But
it is that fundamental contradiction at the heart of liberalism that I think really breaks it down. Some of the other ways in which liberalism can be tyrannical is when it seeks to resolve conflicting values. A classic example of this was during the Obama administration with the healthcare mandate to provide contraception and abortion by companies to the employees. And that led into trouble with Hobby Lobby, because now what we have is a violation of the First Amendment, the religion, freedom of religion. And now, but they say, well, but it's a right that a woman can have family planning provided. Well, so now we have two rights that are in conflict. And what happens is, basically, whoever can marshal the most political support, the most political power, is able to then compel the other side to just give up and, knuckle under. In many ways, this is what, in After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre said, that modern-day democracy is a perpetual civil war carried on with ballots, not bullets.
Yeah, I guess in the Hobby Lobby situation, that really goes back to what we talked about earlier, that when you have a conflict of somebody wants one thing, somebody else wants other thing, you look at which desire is more fits into the liberal order better. And the desire for free contraception does better at making people individualistic and breaking down connections to the family. Whereas religious concerns, you tend to create this connection among people that's outside the state, outside the market, and that claims superior validity. So obviously, religion is going to lose, and the feminists are going to win, and that's what happened. You could see that in and I think in the last election before last, the 2012 election, the Obama campaign put out some little ad about Julia, who is the ideal recipient of their favors. And basically it was this woman who goes through her whole life you're relying on the government to help her through things. It means that pay for her education when she decides to have a child with no man in sight. It takes care of that. When she has a health problem, it looks after that. So she's totally relying on the government, and that's the ideal. Whereas, what the vision Hobby Lobby had was of a society in which people rely on the family more, in which some sort of transcendent commitment has more of a role, and that's obviously going to lose.
Yeah. There's 2 points that I want to make on that. The one is with the family. Back in the 90s, Fareed Zakaria interviewed Lee Kuan Yew. I don't know if he was still president of Singapore at the time. He might have already stepped down, but he said that you in the West don't seem to understand the importance of family. We in the East know this because empires rise and fall, institutions rise and fall. There's always one thing that'll be there when crises are always going to happen: floods, droughts, wars, plagues. The one institution that's always there to pick you up is the family. When all the others have crumbled into dust and you need to stay alive, you can always rely on the family. And he says you don't view that anymore. You don't understand that anymore. And also, C.S. Lewis said that the only way a man can truly be free is if he's eating his own mutton on his own table on his own land. And by making somebody wholly dependent on the government for every stage of life is the antithesis of freedom, because freedom is, well, going back to Aristotle, it's self-sufficiency, right? Societies are organized around families because families are the nuclear unit of a society. They're self-sufficient. They're the lowest level at which you have a self-sufficient organism. And from there, you combine them and rearrange them into more complicated self-sufficient organisms.
Yeah, well, the liberal vision, excuse me, is not this sort of bottom-up evolution of political society as a whole from more basic institutions, because it doesn't believe in any more basic institutions. It really has this idealized view that there's the individual, and then there's the universal featureless state. And it's supposed to be a perfectly rational order that brings the two into a functional whole. And your family connections just mess that up. So, it's basically different view of things. The idea that the liberal state comes and goes, so you need something to fall back on, just isn't present, because the liberal state is viewed as sort of the social and metaphysical absolute.
Yeah, basically, the modern nation state arises out of the philosophy of people like Hobbes and Locke. And, Hobbes titled his book Leviathan, where he makes the case that we need an all-powerful state to adjudicate between these warring factions in Europe. And really, Locke is just kind of a nicer version of Leviathan. I mean, it's still the same thing. And the state becomes a god. I mean, Hobbes even refers it to as a god. And we see with this liberal order that it has taken upon itself, the place that God once took in the hearts and minds of the European man.
Yeah, it's the ultimate, beyond which there is nothing. That really is its status, because you can't. They don't like this pointed out, but you really can't appeal to anything beyond the liberal state. You can complain that it's not itself to a sufficient degree, but there really isn't any authority or community or functional set of relationships that is viewed as more durable or fundamental or outside the state. That's a tendency of liberalism and also of modern Western political thought generally. And obviously, at some point it's going to give you catastrophe. But In the meantime, it actually has been very effective in things like winning wars, increasing production. Centralizing and disciplining works very well for a while, but after a while, the sort of informal social basis for it breaks down, and you got big problems and nothing to fall back on.
We're beginning to see this already as a result of the sexual revolution. Again, most extremely in the Black inner city communities, but also in Latino and increasingly white communities. And this is one of the sort of snake eating its own tail kind of things about liberalism, is it is not able to. Liberalism is essentially parasitic because it cannot produce a stable growing population. The population of a liberal society is an aging and a dying one. We see this in Europe and we see this in the United States. What it has to do is it has to incorporate the youth from more traditionalist societies who actually have children, indoctrinate them, and but what happens is, if liberalism doesn't get a new crop of traditionalists to re-educate, it dies. And if liberalism is successful in re-educating the world, it dies because there's nobody left having children. And so liberalism is a snake eating its own tail. And it ultimately can't survive because it strikes at the very root of any social order. Has to do at least this thing. It has to be able to propagate itself. And liberalism can't do that. At least it can't do it organically because it doesn't have children. It, in fact, discourages having children, right? We have all these environmentalists saying that, oh, well, you've committed a crime against the planet by having more than 2 kids. And liberal orders are very keen on enforcing these kinds of global mandates on limited population. In fact, I think it was in the 70s, and when India wanted to get some loans from the IMF to develop, those loans came with the stipulation that they would essentially forcibly sterilize large parts of the population. And so this connection with sterile existence, sterile sexuality, means that it's essentially not sustainable. And even if it's successful beyond its wildest dreams and makes us all liberals, it's still going to die. And that's a problem liberalism hasn't overcome.
Yeah, it's a basic problem. I mean, there's no way of accounting for the family, and most fundamentally, there's no way of accounting for the parent-child relationship within liberalism, because the idea is that you have these separate individuals with each with his own interest, and that just doesn't fit the parent-child relationship. I mean, you don't raise kids that way, and it tries to separate and break down social networks that offer parent support, that chips away at the ideals that make people think that, well, part of fulfilled life is having children and the continuity of the family and of the community, because it doesn't like continuity, and it doesn't like the idea of a essentialist way of fulfilling life by acting in accordance with your nature. So that in all these ways, it breaks down the psychological, philosophical, social preconditions of family life and having children. So that it's a basic problem. I don't see a way out of it. Liberalism, as it advances, it tries to become ever clearer and more transparent conceptually and in its practices, so that it has a very hard time adjusting to anything that problems that result from its basic principles. Neoconservatives are people who try to do that. They say that, well, we're liberals and we want to maintain the liberal order, but you got to stick a little traditionalism into it to keep it going. And in the first place, that doesn't work, because you can't use traditionalism, the view that people have a nature, that they have transcendent goods. You can't use that as a means to liberal ends. And secondly, they end up losing the arguments because they're fundamentally liberal, and they're arguing for something that isn't liberal. So they've always lost, and they've always abandoned their positions, and that's not going to stop.
Well, that kind of reminds me of Robert Louis Dabney, the Southern Presbyterian writer who wrote that the reason why Northern conservatism always loses is because it's fundamentally liberal, and it won't stick to the actual principles of traditional conservative values. It's always for the sake of expediency, and then when of course, then they jettison those values once it ceases to be expedient, and so they're always they're only retarding the growth of the liberal order, never actually rolling it back.
Yeah, they're dragging their feet, and that's not good enough. I mean, they're saying, well, gee, this is going too fast, or this isn't common sense, or aren't there going to be problems? But they have no principled response. And especially as the world becomes more legalized and bureaucratized, that is simply not a sufficient answer. They always lose.
Yeah. Well, we're about the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we end this?
Yeah, it's a big hole we're falling into. And as I said, I mean, the way out is to, in concept, is to say, well, gee, what's life about? What's social life about? It's about figuring out what's good, what the right human life is, what the best human life is, and organizing the world or working together with others to organize the world so that they can do that together. And yeah, I mean, that's an argument that's possible to make. And I think it's one that we have to develop in dealing with sort of the world outside self-conscious traditionalists. While also trying to live as well and as loyally and as rightly as we can. And so that's my prescription for what everybody should do. And so you want to end up with something that's a little bit positive.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your time, James. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.